Okay, so we're going to start. This is Survive and Thrive and Financial Strategies and Scenario Planning for Nonprofits and Social Enterprises, particularly in the current uncertain times that we're facing with COVID-19. So I wanted to just really thank everybody for participating. We've had an overwhelming response to this webinar. And so, really feeling like, it's an opportunity for us to strategize and think as a sector around how we want to, both have our organizations survive, but also to even look at how we can thrive within this situation. So we have myself, it's a little bit about Scale Collaborative. We are specifically work with nonprofits and charities around financial diversification and financial resiliency strategies. And we do this through a variety of different programs and models. And we also work along Vancouver Island for building a strong ecosystem for social enterprise, social procurement, and social finance. The place that really resonates in terms of our work that we're doing and bringing to this webinar is our program called Thrive, Thriving Nonprofits, and it's a 6-month program that's really does that deep dive into financial resilience strategies and how nonprofits and organizations, charities can become stronger and become more able to navigate a whole bunch of different situations and build up enterprising revenue streams, build up assets, and take that lens. And so it's with that capacity and knowledge and expertise in doing this kind of work over the past 5 years and longer, 5 years that Thrive's been in existence, but longer as an organization in terms of supporting other organizations to be able to be financially resilient and strong. So myself and Lee are the two people that are going to be presenting our webinar today. And Lee Heron is a long-time nonprofit executive, worked in the public sector for a while, and you saw his bio. And he has run and been ED of nonprofits, as well as been board chairs and on boards for a very long time, and has supported dozens and dozens of organizations through beginning to identify and develop strong financial strategies for their organizations. And one thing I super appreciate in working with Lee is his view of looking through the world and organizations through numbers. And whenever I come to an Excel sheet or financial challenge, we take it to Lee, and Lee's brain is amazing in this way. So such a privilege. And myself, I've also been in my nonprofit world for my whole life, working for organizations around social innovation, social finance, operated and run social enterprises, and been executive director and ED of nonprofit organizations as well, been on boards and so on. So, and the work that I do at Scale is primarily around what we call our ecosystem building work. So together, Lee and I have put together this webinar, and I also want to really acknowledge Amy Gudgeon with Watershed Partners and her team in Chicago, who's also looking at how to build financial resiliency with organizations through this time, and have been in contact and connection with her, and they have been very open around sharing some of their resources. And so we've been able to add our own resources, build upon what they've done, contextualize it for the Canadian context, and to really, as a community and as a team and as a sector, to be able to navigate our way through this experience. So our webinar today will be 45 minutes. It's pretty dense, and we're going to go back and forth between Lee and I. Lee, do you want to go forward one more? One more shot? Yeah. So we'll go back and forth go back one, please. Yeah, go back and forth between Lee and I. And so we'll have 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for just questions. We'd like to end it around the hour mark. But at that last half hour that we've done is a chance Lee will stay online. And if you have specific questions and need some coaching around your organization in particular, either can share that do that work together, or can take that offline. So just wanted to give you an idea of how that goes. We'll have a chat box. If as questions come up, please use that chat box. And we are recording the webinar, and we'll send it out alongside the tools that we talk about afterwards. So I want to recognize that this is a really, really stressful time, and it's a stressful time for many organizations, and especially in leadership positions, and that the most critical piece, there's so many critical pieces that go on here, but one of the critical pieces is managing and supporting your own stress and navigating through that. So these are just some tips to just, take care of you, make sure you're sleeping, connect with family and friends, get the support that you're needed. And as well, in this changing and uncertain situation, we know that things every day things are changing fast. So the things that we're facing today may look different tomorrow. And so holding that long view, I think, is really important. So just really encouraging everyone to look after themselves. So in terms of our webinar, if we look at our agenda, we're going to talk through these 8 sections. And first, we're going to talk about what the leadership challenge is, how to survive and thrive in this situation, the different organizational strategies that you can deploy. And then we'll get into the financial aspect of things, calculating burn rate, being able to run scenarios of short and medium term financial scenarios. And then what are the next steps that you can take as an organization and that we might want to take as a sector. All right, thanks. I'm going to pass it over to Lee.
Thanks, Christy. This is a leadership challenge. People look to us as leaders of organizations, and they expect us to make the right decisions, good decisions, if necessary, hard decisions. I think it's really important that we are in touch with our own values, and so that and that we take the time to gather the information we need, so that when we do take decisions, and some of those decisions may be hard decisions, we can ensure that we're doing them fairly, that we're behaving in an ethical fashion, and that in a way that's consistent with our own values and integrity. But this is also an opportunity to rethink everything. We are taking actions today that we would never have thought about 30 days ago, 60 days ago, 90 days ago. And 30 days from now, we still don't have a clear picture of what actions we might be taking then. And so just recognize that there is an opportunity here to reevaluate historical ways of doing things and see if potentially there might be different and even possibly better ways of doing things going forward. We do really want to talk about surviving and thriving. Key to surviving, number one, maybe not the most important from the point of view of everybody on the call, but it is critical for our organizations that we don't run out of cash. There's also a huge range of relationships that we need to preserve through the coming weeks and months, with various groups that are key to the long-term health of our organization. And last but not least, we can't lose our ability to operate in the future. This is not a complete list of things we need to do to survive, but it is a core list. But really, it's not just about surviving. Ideally, we'd like to be able to identify if during this difficult period there are ways that we can actually strengthen our organization and come out stronger in the long run than we are today. And that might mean finding creative ways to increase or create more resources and sources of self-reliance for ourselves. It'll be finding creative ways to strengthen our relationships during this difficult period with all of the groups that matter. And last but not least, maybe there's things we can do to improve our operations and tighten our standards over the next several months. Certainly, what we used to think of as cleanliness and what we now think of as cleanliness are very different. That's just one area in which all of our organizations are going to be tightening our standards in the future. But there may be several other ways, and these will become clearer to us as time goes on. I'm going to pass it back to my colleague Christy now to talk through different strategies that organizations are contemplating during this period.
Thanks, Lee. So we looked at what was happening with organizations and saw that there's essentially 5 different types of responses that we see organizations needing to take. We have organizations that are having to ramp up to meet a critical community need. The ones that are often like frontline services are serving vulnerable populations, senior populations that are now, as a result of this, requiring an increase in their service. So this is a really a quick short-term scaling response to the current situation. Then we also see organizations that are beginning to see new needs that are emerging from community that they may be well positioned to serve, but hadn't really thought about that in previous times. And so we're seeing that emerging need and that place of being able to experiment with new products or services or approaches or programs that may meet emerging community need that may extend beyond this time period. So those are what we call like the experimenting organizations. And some of these are a yes and. As we go through the list, you might find yourself in a couple of different ones. And then there's the organizations that we're calling steady state organizations. So it's like hold what you're doing. You might continue your service that you're doing as it is, but looking at different delivery methods. One organization that we work with, it's a counseling organization. They do in-person counseling and so on. They're beginning to look at how do they shift that to a different delivery method and a different model, but they're still providing a similar level of service to the similar groups that they are. Then we have organizations that are beginning to look at hibernation. So we would say hibernation is during this time, there's a vastly different change to what's needed in community and how you can access your services and what you can do. And so it's entering into that period of lower activity. And so looking at strategies of how do you hibernate your organization, maybe do some of the work that's been on your back burner for a while, but still knowing that as we emerge from this, those services and programs and everything are still required. And so you'll need to be able to think about that restart out of hibernation. So what does hibernation look like? How do you restart? And then there's another couple that we wanted to throw up that we're not going to talk about a lot today. And that's around beginning to look at, is there opportunities for amalgamation? And that amalgamation between seeing where there's partnerships that really align, that you've developed new relationships, or you begin to see sort of a place where you can be stronger together, and thinking about that different kind of approach for your organization. And then we wanted to also say there's some organizations that maybe have been struggling for a while, or maybe are finding that this situation has really put them into an untenable situation. And so there is a place of also looking at some that might need to move into shutdown and how to begin to wind down those operations. So for our webinar today, I mean, no matter where you are in and how you see yourself within that frame of those organizational strategies, we're looking at that need for understanding your current cash, right? You need to understand what your frame is going to look like, where you currently are standing, and then you can begin to deploy these different kind of strategies accordingly. Today we'll talk primarily about the middle three. I'd say like experiment, steady state, hibernation. Ramping up requires new resources, and there's a lot that goes into ramping up. And amalgamation and shutdown also are slightly different considerations, and beginning to think through those strategies in a different way. But the tools that we provide today will be useful either way. So in terms of resource requirements, if you think about what you need in terms of fitting into those strategies, you can see that, for ramping up, obviously you need more resources, and you need much more. And we're seeing some of that emergency response funding coming out across the country that is helping those organizations that need to ramp up. Around the experiment, beginning to experiment, you need a little bit more, but not much more, because you're beginning to just test and try and reach out and in that early stage. So not a lot more. For steady state, it's looking at that access of current resources and keeping them going. And for hibernation, it's beginning to look at, you need less resources. And depending on what you hibernate and how you hibernate, maybe quite significantly less. So again, the conversations, and on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see where those resources can come from. And then amalgamate is redirecting existing resources, and then shutdown is when you begin to look at obviously quite significant less resources required. So you can see that strategy, where the resources are required and what kind of level, and then where you might be able to have those conversations and the most likely source for those resources.
Christy, maybe shut off your video.
How come?
You're breaking up for some folks.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's good to know. I will stop my video. Okay, can we go forward to the next slide? So in terms of thinking through the critical questions around those strategies, It's beginning to ask these questions. So we've again identified where the strategy is around how to ramp up. So, how do you ramp up safely? And from where can you secure those necessary resources? What do we need to maybe look at what else we do in our organization to stop temporarily, to be able to allow the response where you need to ramp up and to direct resources that way? How do you manage that new activity? And then what are the plans that we need to make looking down the road and being able to return to normal operations? So those are some of those questions around ramp up. Around that experiment, it's beginning to ask, what services and resources for our community can we explore at this time? And so really looking at what might be timely, what is needed right now. And then looking within your team around who can lead this experiment? And then how can we evaluate if this experiment is working and is meeting the emerging needs of the community? Around your steady state, it's around, how can we safely continue to operate? Can we safely continue to provide our services to our community and with our staff? And so taking that safety perspective. And then how do we begin to think about shifting your delivery model? And so there's amazing online tools that are available. But sometimes even just the telephone is an effective way to do delivery model. But there's a lot of different ways that are emerging and can be explored. But that question of how to shift. And then how do we maintain our organizations and our relationships? And so in terms of hibernation, it's beginning to just look at what is it that we can do, that we can slow down, that we can stop, that we can begin to reduce the costs, taking care of the people that work for us, taking care of the people that we serve, taking care of our community and our donors, and being able to focus and maintain those relationships and organizations virtually. So increasing the communication piece. And as well, beginning to think already forward, what plans, if you begin to look at hibernation, what plans do you need to begin to put in place so you can restart normal operations again? And this is also, I mentioned earlier, a good time to bringing forward some of those projects that you might have been putting in the back burner, research, systems projects, those kind of things, and spending the time working on those now during this hibernation period.
Thanks, Christy. So this term burn rate, you may or may not be familiar with it. For those who are familiar with it, what I'm talking about is net burn rate, not gross burn rate. But what this refers to is that basically when we go into a deficit position, and not all of us will be in a deficit position, but some of us definitely will have been thrown into a deficit position through this crisis. Once we're in deficit, we start burning cash. The burn rate really is a measure of monthly cash flow, negative monthly cash flow. It's not a very accurate measure, but it is a good rule of thumb measure to let you know how fast you're sort of sinking as the months go by. And it's a very simple calculation. It's monthly continuing cash receivables less monthly continuing non-discretionary payables. That equals your cash burn per month. Notice that I use the terms receivables and payables. When we're in deficit and we need to manage, and there's a crisis like there is at the moment, especially in terms of our funding model, we need to think about cash, which is not necessarily our budget, but what we're expecting to get in the door, and similarly what we're obliged to send out the door. It's convenient that it's March 30th today. Tomorrow's March 31st. At the end of the day, you can go online and look at your bank balances and figure out if there's any other cash that might be sitting that needs to get to the bank, but that will give you, for April 1st, a great opening balance. Your cash on hand on April 1st, divided by that crude burn rate, gives you an idea of how long you can survive. This needs to be supplemented with a detailed cash flow, and that's what I'm going to spend the rest of this time talking about, is how to build that cash flow out over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months, and then also how to run different scenarios. But fundamentally, if you're burning a lot of cash, that is, if your burn rate is high, figuring out how to get or continue to get revenue in the door, and how to minimize ongoing expenses, those two actions will reduce your burn rate. The question of deferred revenue is a really challenging management problem. There are a number of funders on the line, and they would hope that I would tell you that they've sent you deferred revenue with the hopes that you will use it to do what you've contracted or committed to do. Like I say, this is a tricky problem. Most funders don't segregate their funds or require you to segregate them. And so you do have access to that cash, but you don't want to dip into it if you don't have a plan to ensure that you are able to pay it back later. You may be able to ask the funder to relax requirements. And it may be that there's the funding is permitted, that you can use it for ongoing operations at this time. And if you are able to do those things, those are definitely desirable moves. So I'm going to walk you through this in detail with some examples on the sheet. But in order to start with your cash flow, you're going to need some information. And so it's important to gather that information before you start. Firstly, your opening cash balance and any cash equivalents that you may have available to you. If you have deferred revenue, you'll need to know what the schedule of deferred revenue is. If you have access to lines of credit or credit cards, it will be important to know what those limits are. And similarly, if you have access to reserves, what your starting reserve account balances are. When you're building your scenarios, start with what you know and with what seems most likely today. That's going to be your baseline or your base case scenario. Again, you're going to estimate receivables and payables by month on a cash basis. So that means when you are going to receive funds or be obliged to pay funds, not necessarily what your budget says where you've recognized revenue evenly through the year. Here we're trying to figure out, when is the cash coming in? When will we have access to it? But don't forget that you need to put in place some placeholders for the larger non-discretionary occasional or annual expenditures. Those could include things like property taxes, insurance, etc. I'm just going to turn on my laser pointer here. Oops, that was the wrong button. There we go. So this is what the sheet looks like before it gets populated, and I'll show you a specific example. I'm also going to be adjusting this a little bit based on the feedback that I get during the session before I send it out. But basically, there's room for you to add 15 revenue streams here. You won't put anything in this column, but you will put in amounts that you expect to receive out in the green, and then this will add up automatically. You'll put in your starting cash balance here. I've given a long list of expense categories and some blank ones, but don't hesitate to write over these. There's nothing special or sacred about these. Moving on, I'm going to give you a specific example of a childcare operation here in British Columbia. Now, this is a specific example, but the reality is that all of our organizations are specific. In this case, they were very lucky to be starting with a healthy $44,000 in the bank, although of that, 10,000 roughly was deferred revenue, and this is the schedule that they have put in through the year. You can see that this organization in the base case is assuming that there will be no revenue from parent fees in April and May, so a 2-month shutdown or hibernation. Luckily, the province of BC has generously supported childcares with double operating funding if they're in shutdown. And so those numbers are reflected here, but none of the other supports for the organization are expected to come in those months. You can see that here we're assuming that we're resuming normal operations, and then that normal operations continues through the rest of the year. You can see that we get a one-time annual funding amount of $10,000 in February. However, that is deferred for the future years, so that balance also goes up into our deferral schedule. You can see in this base case, we're assuming that we're going to be able to access the federal wage subsidy. And so we've reduced the wages here by 75%. We've put in placeholder amounts for large expenses. So here we've got our amount to reopen, which is, you know, a startup amount that we're putting in May so that we can reopen in June. We've got 2-3 payroll months, unfortunately, in June and December, and so our payroll is going to be higher. We've got property taxes to pay in July. We don't know yet whether that will be able to be deferred, but you know, we'll wait to hear. But in the meantime, we're planning to pay it in July, and we've got our annual insurance bill that's due in February. Yeah, and there's a great question there. What if it's not available in February? We could build that into our worst case scenario, and I'll show you that when we get to it. In this case, again, this organization was very lucky to be starting with $30,000 in reserves. You can see, though, that in this base case, even with a 2-month shutdown, with the generous supports and wage subsidy that they can access, they're expecting to run a surplus for the year. There's a few months of deficit, but largely they're in balance. And as such, they haven't drawn down their reserves at all, and their ending reserve balance is the same as what it started at. You can see that their bank account actually grows through the year because they're running a surplus. You can see that they're operating within, they don't have access to credit, but they're above zero in every given month. And you can see that they haven't touched their deferred revenue. So pretty good starting place for this organization in terms of its base case. However, we need to plan not just for the best possible scenario, but also possibly for the worst and the middle case. I'm not going to do a worst and a middle case. I'm just going to show you a worst case scenario, but the tool will support 3 scenarios. And if you are competent in Excel and you want to add more sheets and make more scenarios, you can have as many scenarios as you want. In order to think through these more challenging scenarios, though, we need to look at each revenue stream individually and assess whether it's going to come or not. Someone asked a question in the chat, what if it doesn't come? Great question. Build that into your worst case scenario. What if we're not closed for 2 months? What if we're closed for 4 months or 6 months? What if we reopen and our fee-for-service business doesn't start at the level at which we had historically been operating? And what if we had our annual fundraiser planned for June and it's not going to be able to go ahead, and so we lose all of the extra funds that were expected to come from that? So what you're going to do is adjust the revenue streams in these scenarios. And again, my suggestion would be here to make sure that the worst case really is the worst case. So assume the absolute worst, within reason. Today, I just heard on the radio for the first time that in the UK, the Prime Minister was saying we might be shut down for 6 months. Well, that might mean that my worst case scenario that I was working on yesterday of only 6 months shutdown isn't worst enough. But that's the thing with these scenario tools, is that you can play with them and model out what you need to think through. At this point, I'm suggesting don't adjust your expenses, but because that's something that you can start to do once you see where you're at. But what you want to see is, if the revenue really goes to the worst case, where do we end up? And so going back to this example, we have the same starting conditions, the same deferred schedule, but this time you can see that I'm setting it so that they don't resume operations until October. I'm also assuming that for whatever reason, we're not able to access that wage subsidy. And mainly that's for illustration purposes in this case, but you never know. We haven't read the fine print yet. So my worst case scenario today still includes thinking we might not get that relief on expenses. I've still got the same placeholders for annual expenses, 2 payrolls in each, or 3 payrolls in each month, and property taxes and insurance. I've moved the startup expenses from May to September to reflect that we're now opening in October. Now, you can see this organization, unfortunately, with a 6-month shutdown, is ending up running a significant deficit this year. That puts pressure on the closing cash balances, and you can see that, in fact, as soon as July, we're already below zero, and since we don't have credit at this point, that's a problem. You can see, again, this is just a check, but it's telling you that we're below the bottom of our available credit, starting in July. But here you can also see that we've started to dip into our deferred revenue as early as June. So it's kind of alerting us that even though we still have money in the bank, that money is theoretically reserved against future periods, and that we're starting to dip into it. So the first question you want to ask yourself is, will we make it to June 30th? 3 months is sort of a good starting place, but if you're more comfortable with 4 or 5 or 6, that's fine. The tool allows you to see where you are at the end of each month. In that first scenario, you could see that the base case scenario, you could see the organization was very healthy through to June 30th, and in fact, through to next March 31st. In the worst case scenario, by June 30th, we were already starting to dip into our deferred revenue, and by July, we were needing access to more funds. As you identify where you're at, you're going to identify some particular things on which you might need to take action. You probably need to take, under these circumstances, immediate steps to get cash in the door. You need to take immediate steps to conserve cash wherever possible. You may need to consider staffing actions. I'm hopeful that we won't, especially with some of the wage supports that were offered, but there are some organizations for whom this is just going to be too stressful. I would put staffing actions as a very last resort. As you work through the actions to increase your cash coming in, to conserve cash or cut expenses, and if you contemplate staffing actions, you can add those changes, those decisions as you make them, or new information as you get it into your scenarios, and see how your situation changes. And I'll just throw this out there. Some organizations may find that they actually, no matter what, have built up sufficient cash reserves that they're still in a long-term surplus, even in the worst case scenario. If there's cash that you have, and this is an opportunity, your organization's in hibernation, this is an opportunity to undertake projects. What are projects that you could undertake now, investments you could make now that would serve you well when we resume service, whenever that is? If you're in a position where you need to generate cash from operations, there's a few things to, well, I've got actually a list of 15 things that you can do here. I'm not going to talk through all of these, just a few I want to highlight. 1, get all cash on hand in the bank. You may think that you've got all cash on hand in the bank, but make sure that you've looked in the safe if your organization takes cash at the front. Did all of the cash and checks actually get deposited before you shut down? Is anybody checking the mail at your organization to make sure that checks that are coming in the mail are actually going to get also to the bank? 3, receivables. Many of us don't have receivables, but for some of us do. And for those that do, we need to sort of classify whether we expect there's a likelihood that we can get that money. We may wish to think about offering incentives to people to accelerate rapid payment, just to get us the payment faster. We may wish to offer significant discounts or relief to people in order that we can collect at least part of receivables that are low quality or where there's a real risk of default. With 6 and 7, I'm not an accountant. Please get your own accounting advice, but it is possible at this point. The government has announced that you can delay remitting GST if you're a GST remitter. If you are getting a rebate, though, you will want to file as quickly as possible and get that rebate check coming back to you in the mail. Last but not least, on this slide, if you are an organization that has GICs that don't roll over except once a year, you definitely don't want to roll them over right now. Turn them into cash, put it in a savings account, and wait to see whether you need access to that money. A few more steps. Number 9 sounds obvious, but it's not necessarily obvious. Make sure everyone in your organization knows that there is a freeze on spending. Nobody likes having that command and control environment where all expenditures of any level or magnitude need to be approved before they're made, but we're in an environment where that is more than prudent. If you have access to a credit card, I'm not recommending running up a balance, but what I am recommending is that you use the grace period of your credit card to give you access to cash, to offset the need for cash in the short run. So you can set up all of your monthly expenses and recurring expenses and small suppliers to flow through that credit card. Last thing here, review everything. If your organization is not in a situation where you're ramping up, this is a great time to look at everything that's going through. If you have facilities that are closed, are there services to those facilities that you can pause? I'm not recommending turning off your security monitoring service, but you don't necessarily need the garbage picked up anywhere near as frequently. You can turn off, set your heat to economy settings and so on your thermostats. If you do have a credit card, you might be surprised to see all the services that are being billed to it. They're small amounts, but if you take these actions, you can conserve hundreds of dollars per month, and sometimes, and if your large organization is large enough, maybe thousands of dollars per month. It can all add up and defer harder decisions into the future. I'm going to let my colleague Christy talk about this slide here.
Thanks, Lee. So in terms of the last resort, and we talked about finding other ways to conserve cash and bring in cash, and as Lee outlined, and then we also know that for nonprofit organizations, the number one, cost on our balance sheets and income statements tends to be on our income statements is staffing. And so when it's looking at potentially reducing staff costs, it's really beginning to look at, evaluating your staff team, taking that lens of who can you afford not to lose that's critical to your operations, and doing that first analysis, and then really considering your options. So we just provided some links here to the different options that are available, starting with, reduction of hours, having conversations with staff about how that could look, wage subsidies that are being rolled out, and the 75% I think wage subsidy that was announced on Friday, I think would be is a huge relief for many. And so looking at what that is, and I think they're still working out the details of how to access that. The work sharing that the Canadian government has come out with. There's the supplemental unemployment benefit, which is what is when you have a temporary work stoppage and you can top up EI to a certain amount and allow you to have staff go, but EI covers a portion of it and you still cover a portion of the wage as well. So again, looking at those different options that are available, both through federal, as well as if there's anything that's coming out through the province, and that will be different for each province. It's really important that you have in writing and with consent with your staff, so that you're not looking at a potential of a constructive dismissal during this time. So again, we recommend always to get legal advice, to get accounting advice around any of these things. And so check with accounting advice, to check with your legal advice to find out what's possible, as well as having those open conversations with your staff. And so we're talking, it's really important to get that advice, to act with integrity, to be respectful of staff in the situation that it is, as still being able to make the decisions that you need to make for your organization and for your community.
Thanks, Christy. So if you're taking those immediate cash actions and or potentially contemplating staffing actions, you can again feed those new assumptions into your scenario. Maybe you want to not feed it into the worst case, maybe you want to feed it into the middle case, but that information will allow you to now evaluate your medium-term cash needs. So will you make it to December 31st? Will you make it to March 31st? Do you have enough cash on hand at all points through this scenarios to restart your normal operations? Will you be able to pay those property taxes and renew your insurance when they come due? Is there any risk that you will get into your deferred revenue and not be in a position to honor your commitments that you've made to funders? And if so, that's certainly something to be concerned about. But this tool will allow you to see when your shortfall occurs and how much it is. And so then based on that, you would also identify specific actions about finding access to additional cash in the medium term. Just don't forget, debt can cause obligations. So if you're taking on debt, make sure you have a plan to repay it. So what are medium-term sources of cash? Some of our organizations have reserves. What are those reserves for? What do you need to do to access them? This certainly seems like an extraordinary circumstance, but if your board had parked those reserves against a capital plan, they may not be keen to release them in this crisis. And so you might need to negotiate with that. If those reserves are invested in a way that is not liquid at the moment, you might also work with your treasurer or your finance committee to consider how you get liquidity from those. If you have a credit card, ask about increasing your limit and run more of your monthly recurring expenses through it. If you don't have a credit card, this might be a good time to see if you can get one. If you don't have the line of credit, again, it might be a good time to get one. If you do have a line of credit, ask about getting a temporary lift to that to allow you a little bit more flexibility in managing your cash flow. Again, it's not a good idea to live in your line of credit, but as a temporary cash flow supporting tool, it's a great protection for your organization. There are other loans available. I'm not going to go into it in detail. But don't hesitate to consider, under the circumstances, that there might be non-traditional sources of capital, people that care about your organization and are willing to help you bridge what is obviously a crisis. Last but not least, if you need to raise cash, you may need to consider selling any assets that you do have, provided that they're surplus to your operations and not core. This may or may not be a good time to liquidate assets because you may or may not receive fair value, but it certainly is not off the table in a crisis. So now I'm going to show you in this example, if you recall, we were dipping into our deferred revenue. This was our worst case scenario. This is just going to illustrate how this sheet can be used as a planning tool. So we can see, and the treasurer has expressed some concern that we're starting to dip into our deferred revenue in June. And so we have a board meeting and we determine that we're going to draw down our reserves over a 2-month period. Unfortunately, that only gets us to August. And you can see that we start to get back into our deferred revenue and in fact exceed the bottom of our bank account in September without resuming operations until October. So we do have 5 months notice now. We know we can make it that far. And so we go to the bank and we start negotiating access to a line of credit based on our historical profitability. And the fact that in this particular organization, they actually own their premises. And so it's very likely they could gain access to a line of credit with the premises as security. We put in that access to credit in each of these cells here because it doesn't go away. And you can see that we also build in an amount for using the line of credit because using credit is not free. But you can see that now, although we're below zero here in our bank account, we're still within our $30,000 line of credit. And you can see the treasurer is now happy and our funders are happy because we haven't dipped into our deferred revenue points in this period. Yes, we're still 25,000 above our credit circumstances. We're considering this. If we can get our organization back to profitability, and even here we may have to take actions if we're going to use credit, especially in order to get above zero. But hopefully in 2021, we can start rebuilding our reserves. So I'm going to hand it back to my colleague, Christy. Is she there?
Thanks, Lee.
Yeah.
So when we look at emerging stronger from this crisis, I think there's the 5 key conditions. So really looking at having an effective and efficient cost and operating model. And so this is an opportunity. We talk about this as a challenge, but with that as an opportunity of looking at how your operating model currently is, and is there ways to make it more effective and efficient? And this is forcing us all to look at that question. And out of that, there may be some surprises that grow our organization in a stronger way. Having us be really laser focused on community need, committed to our staff, and with strong communication for our funders and donors and supporters. And so these are the conditions that we think are part of growing and supporting strong organizations that will thrive both during and post of this situation, as well as just looking at what is realistic for your organization in particular to achieve. So we recommend gathering your deep thinkers and beginning to craft a strategic response. The tool that Lee laid out identified your cash needs, being able to say, now how are we going to respond to this situation, both now and in the future, to have our organization positioned for greatness as we emerge. And we say, like, there's amazing people in all organizations across the community, as well as your networks, your community goodwill, your advisors, your mentors, your board. How do you begin to bring those people together and say, what can we do strategically to respond and to thrive in this situation? And then being able to test that against your worst case, to really have that transparent communication of your plan to your key stakeholders, and then to express clearly what your financial needs and timing will be. And so the tool that Lee has created will really help to track that out, so you're making thoughtful and strategic requests as you need them. To be able to stick to your plan, but be open to change. The situation that we faced last week is different than the situation we're facing this week, and it's changing continually. And so it's being able to, hold the vision, but have the plans, be willing to adapt and move according to how the context is shifting underneath our feet. And that this will be a long journey. Even as we begin to emerge out, it's going to take a while for us to take the lessons learned, to shift and move forward into how we want to be, to continue those communication and to look at our communities. So I think that long journey is beginning to plan and think about it in the short, medium, but also that long term. We have some requests specifically for donors and funders who might be on the line, and this is just our request that we see in terms of the needs in the sector is, please keep your funds moving. We've heard of some funders beginning to pause their decisions around grants, and we're really encouraging to please not do that, to continue those funds moving, to shift any existing grants that might exist into unrestricted and operational funds, so that organizations can deploy them where they're needed at the current amount, to suspend or delay the reporting requirements, just to take that pressure off, and then to maintain and even expand funding levels. And just the way that we're seeing is that there's going to be a need for those responsive grants, those rapid emergent responses, to those needing to scale quickly, and we see that those are coming out. We also think that resiliency grants to help experiments and shifts in steady state organizations, so to help them to be resilient and to stay steady through this time. And then to also begin to think out as well as, what are the recovery grants? What is going to be needed to get started and recovered post this crisis, or as this continues to move forward? And then we'd also like to make a suggestion that funders coordinate their funds locally, especially the local funders, to be able to have that response. And we've seen Boston has a really great example of how they've coordinated a number of different funders together to respond to that community really, really effectively. And we'd also like to please put a call out to organizations that are serving smaller communities that might not have access to strong local funders. And so being able to have large funders and the funder network really remember that there's amazing communities and organizations that are all over this country that are needing our support and able to respond to their community in this crisis better than many can. And so we want to support all of us across the sector. And I did want to thank you from Community Microlending, and also to look at organizations that may not be charitable. So nonprofits don't sometimes have blocked to funding, and so to think about and look at potentially funding nonprofit organizations in addition to charities. So in terms of how scale can help, this is what we do. We coach, we're providing webinars. We're going to continue to provide webinars and looking at things around, what if you need to look at shutdown? What if you need to look at ramp up? And we can dig deeper into some of those if there's an interest, to advocate as we see what's happening in Victoria and Greater Vancouver Island and the coast, and really advocating for our communities here and connecting to any other organizations that are advocating for the sector and trying to support our sector wide. And then to continue to develop tools and resources that will help organizations to be able to navigate what's happening. Lee, do you have another slide?
Sorry, I was typing.
Yes. So we've come to the point of, we made it a little bit late. We said we'd be done by 10:45. It's 10:53. So we'll have a time for some questions on the side. And then if anyone wants to connect specifically with Lee, he'll stay on for a little bit longer. And thank you so much for all participating. Here is our emails and contact information. Feel free to reach out at any time.